And I'll leave it at that because I think we're slightly over time.
Yes, yeah, we're out of time. I think we can move to the next. Where is our host?
Where I'm right here.
Yep. Okay.
Hello.
You have the floor. You can bring on the next set of people. Thanks.
Great.
Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks. Great presentation, great discussion. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome Paolo and Irina for the future of the future, new frameworks for new visioning tools. The session is going to be about 30 minutes. We've got the same ground rules as in prior sessions. The lines are muted, but you can submit questions via the Q&A pod or the chat. We'll keep an eye on those things and make sure that they're transmitted to your speakers. And Paolo and Irina, I'm handing off to you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm going to start with the presentation, but maybe Paolo, you can introduce yourself first, and then I'll go and continue.
Yes, I'm Paolo Cardini. I'm full professor at Rhode Island School of Design, and I teach future-related things, let's say, broadly speaking. So very different aspects of futuring, but especially connected with design artifacts, and tangible elements that help us better understanding and reflect on future.
And I'm Irina Wang. I am an independent researcher and designer, writer, and I was happy to collaborate with Paolo. Well, he was my professor a while ago, and then we went on to co-write this chapter recently on the topic of futures in the Routledge Sustainability textbook. And so that's what this talk developed out of. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. Working, good.
Yep.
Also, hi everybody. I'm not sure who's all there, but thanks for having us. So because Paolo and I are coming at this topic from the context of the design world, we wanted to start with an overview of some of these sort of emergent disciplines within design, starting with what is known as critical design and speculative design. So basically, both of these practices develop or expound upon future scenarios as a way to challenge the current status quo. And in doing so, with diegetic objects, for example, these artifacts are designed and then used to prompt conversations about more desirable alternatives to that status quo. So unlike some other futuring practices, I find that those tend to center technology and innovation as the sort of end all be all, whereas what speculative and critical design practices tend to do is highlight the social and ethical concerns about technological development. So this is an example by Aggie Haynes, which explores the sort of surgically implanted enhancements that could happen, or are currently actually even more and more relevant now, but questioning how far parents might go to ensure their child has the best chance of success in society, which is clearly a technological problem, but also a very much a social and ethical one. Another one of these sub-design disciplines is known as adversarial design, which engages with these political issues, emphasizing the importance of having a productive contestation of ideas that are otherwise seen as sort of standard development towards a better future, quote unquote. And so when a group of us at RISD were asked to design a response to the introduction of eVTOL, basically like flying taxi drone services in cities. One of the first things that we did was visualize the various protests that might occur in response from various parts of society. And this image here is one of the speculative protests that highlight concerns of communities that would get pushed out of urban housing blocks as, let's say, real estate is changing to reflect different transportation routes in the city and access to airways, things like that. And then finally, the practice of discursive design expands on the boundaries of how we can use design and how objects can go sort of beyond this basic form and function language that we often use in design to talk about projects, but rather help us think differently. And so this particular example, a very fun one, is a sort of infamous audio tooth implant project, which is, of course, at its most basic, like a comment on body augmentation, but it also was fun because the media's uptake of it and their like enchantment with these dramatic technological developments. It was sort of proven right by the way that this project was picked up and talked about in the public response and in media. It was also named like best inventions of 2002 in Time magazine, even though this particular tooth device never had any plans to go into production. And handing it over to Paolo.
Yeah, so obviously all these practices, as you have seen, are based on design proposals and using design tools and media to communicate an idea of future. But for instance, in the case of adversarial and speculative design, and in many of the examples related to future thinking, in reality, what is interesting here, and we will start introducing the idea of time connected to this, that is the concept around which is gravitating our work. So the very essence of being adversarial or critical tends to be timeless. So a lot of these proposals are very valuable and more effective if they are not connected to a specific timeline, if they are not related to an ideal future, but they are simply something that are timeless, something that can happen or cannot happen. Yeah, you can pass to the next one. So speculative design and critical design and the use of design to create future scenarios obviously has been going through a critique. So there are parts of these specific disciplines that has been criticized and been retuned. But to mention just a few, quoting Tobias Revel's, let's say, critical list of critical design. So there is speculative design has been appropriated by mainstream business practices. So a lot of this project became highly sensational and not very much coherent with the critical starting point that they were born in first place. Speculative design reinforces one particular notion of better. So this is all the critique that a lot of this design futures are coming from a very restricted perspective, and as they have been developed since the beginning of the 2000s onwards, mostly in North Europe and Europe and North American. So suggesting the idea of universal futures, but in reality representing only a specific perspective on those possible futures. And then speculative design, and this is again particularly connected to what we are talking about today, is the lack of urgency needed to take on political and corporate hypocrisy. So the fact that these speculations often remains speculative futures, they stay in the future and they are not strong enough to really activate an actionable agenda for whoever is engaging with those. So, and this is not a new case about speculation. So if we look back at the radical groups that developed in Italy during the 70s, not only in the UK as well, this is Super Studios Continuous Movement. So the idea of promoting specific future visions, but then not being able to operate within the political aspect and dealing with policies and governance, and try to jump from an idea of contestation and provocation into an idea of actionable agendas. So this is something from Arcade Elflame. The group could have advanced a revolutionary design program if only they had channeled their subversive energies into practical solutions. So we are not wanting in this case to foster futures that is only aiming to practical solutions, because we know how important it is, the intellectual relation with those future visions and how those future visions could foster an idea of democratic participation in the building of a future, so not necessarily in solving the present. But again, I think it's interesting to start relating how a future visions, obviously, specifically within speculative and design practices, can relate to the present and how we can enable people to act on those visions. So in this case, we want to create this argue for this differentiation and to give some sort of priority to alternative realities versus speculative visions approaches. So we think that looking at future as an alternative reality rather than a speculative visions could actually help rooting our analysis, discourse, and reflection more within a place where we can actually act on those scenarios. So alternative realities could be taking place today. They are not limited to technological conversations, as sometimes happens for critical and speculative practices. Takes into consideration socio-technological limits, and they are naturally forced in a contextual framework. So when we are talking about alternative reality, most likely we know where we are and which kind of cultural context we are addressing. So, I mean, this is a very nice quote from Ursula Le Guin. So, and I'm specifically attached to the idea of realists of larger reality. So the idea that looking at future, we can see, we may think as looking to larger realities rather than futures. So expanding our present, understanding alternative ways to live our present and react to our constraints, is still about future because it's not here, but it's not in the future, but is in the present. So this is an approach that we like to foster. Again, this trajectory of thinking can be seen within the design field in itself, when from traditional design, we jumped into speculative and critical design, then to design fiction, and then design realities, as titled from Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, that are huge voices within the speculative and design field. The design realities, their studio, research studio, and the fact that realities has been placed within this framework is in some way suggesting the importance of linking future with what is real, or in their cases considering they are real, but in some way for us is very important that way to look at future as present, or better to say alternative present. So if we abstract ourselves from the idea of future, if we stop thinking about future as something that is clearly produced by a specific present and is clearly referring to a specific present, if we think about future as simply not here and not now, if we think about future as something that is not here yet but could happen suddenly, and could exist within the place we exist, we think that could actually reinforce the possibility of an action and reaction. So one quick example to explain these differences between speculative visions and alternative realities. These are two projects that are talking about the same topics, like scarcity of food, and this future where people will have to find a way to get out of a specific dramatic situation. On the left side, there is Anthony Dunn and Fiona's Rabbie's Foragers, where there is this idea of citizens building up their own solutions through technology and through synthetic biology, creating these devices that enable them to digest something that is undigestible for human beings. And that is clearly set in the future. On the right, we have superflux, the mitigation of shock, where there is this future where, again, citizen scientists, in this case, again, they transform their habitat units into indoor farming and being able to produce the food that they need, again with the use of the technology, but their vision is way more present. It's something that we could eventually see now. We can actually start fostering that specific future, even if we don't need it at the beginning. And we may think also that future about which kind of crops we grow. Maybe they are related to our own specific cultures. Maybe they are related to our own past. So you can see the difference between the two and why we are arguing for the idea of alternative realities. So design is intrinsically a future-making activity, but we usually think about design starting from the present onwards. And this is something that we could like to suggest a change in direction. So the time is a very important thing. Next one, Irina, I need to speed up a bit. So the time is something very important. So, and again, within the idea of time, we tend to follow a Western linear idea of time that is sequential, that is highly connected to the capitalistic perspective of time value. In reality, an expansion of the idea of time is needed to reconsider the different future scenarios. So the cyclical idea of time to arrive to the point that the past, and this is extremely important for us, can be considered as part of the future thinking. This is a graph about how Madagascar people are looking to their past and future. So future is, you cannot see future. Future is in the back of your head. The only thing that you can see is the past, and is visible and is influential. So the future is passing through your head, and in your front head, the only things that you can have is the vision of the past. You never see the future. So this was very inspiring to us in crafting this theoretical framework.
Yeah, and then I'll just add that backtracking, as it's defined here by Rogama, is a focus on a point in history when one could speak of a sustainable equilibrium. I'm just going to quickly compare it to these other practices that might be familiar in the futuring community. But here we can see that forecasting, the black dotted line, follows a thread from present to future, whereas backcasting, which is also quite a popular practice, it draws from the sustainable future back to the present with an effort to then translate that into the future. Whereas backtracking, as we just sort of saw on the other slide, can be seen as circling from present to sustainable past, and then bringing that back into the present in an effort to translate it into the future. So by sort of consciously including the past, as Paolo was saying, into the creation of alternative present realities, I think we can avoid some of these pitfalls that are common in speculative design. So that, not only does it help us imagine more freely, but beyond the limitations of specific present conditions, but it also opens up the diversity of future visions, right? Beyond this Western canon, which is so often just the baseline of where you start when you start with the present. And these so-called universal visions are often very exclusionary and singular, whereas if you started perhaps from various diverse pre-colonial pasts, you can create this sense of ownership around alternative pathways to the future. And then, to be clear, recomplicating this approach, right? This sort of layering of past, present, future is a tale as old as time. I think it might be lacking in parts of the design community, but there are so many examples around the world, in rural communities, indigenous communities, that practice this sort of layering now. And one of the examples that came to my mind was from recent research in northern Finland. So across the Sapni region, essentially, indigenous Sami have been talking about this concept through their traditional handicrafts called doji. So doji lives in this creative tension between tradition and evolution. This quote is from a lovely plaque in the Aceh Museum in Jokmak, where they say, "Without traditions, there is no doji. Without evolution, there is no doji." Right. So a huge part of what the craft is about is passing on traditional knowledge, and at the same time, it is also about the interpretation that every new generation of Doyar bring to the craft. And those interpretations exist in a new context, with new materials, new meanings in the present reality. And tying this back to some cognitive science, so whenever humans cognitively construct and elaborate upon temporal events, fMRI scans show an overlap actually between the areas of our brain that are activated when we think about the past and the areas that are activated when we think about the future. That's my brain, by the way, from an old MRI scan. And then there's also evidence in support of what's called constructive episodic simulation, wherein humans pull elements from our memories to populate our perceptions about the future.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about our own specific disciplines, when we suggest that we should consider more the past, or adding the past to any of our future speculations and future scenario building, that again, we may want to call alternative realities construction. So we analyzed what it could be, and we identified that there is a need to project the past. So a need to see the past as an active element that not only to be inspired to, but also consider the past as the possible future. Then rethinking the present. It's also how specific things can be built on the past. And that's that. I will give you some example about this. And co-creating the future, obviously. I mean, participatory future creation, participatory design, and having a broader audience invited to the table to really create this democratic conversation about the future that we want and we may aspire to. So when we think of when we reflect about how to project the past, a few examples: root bridges, beautiful example of still active technology, not the past, the present. So when we see some images that we think that we may assume that there is a first grade, second grade, or third grade technology. In reality, that's and should be considered obviously a wrong assumption. So the fact that something is the past doesn't mean that it's not technologically ideal. So the idea of projecting the past is exactly how we can consider the past something that can belong to our future as well. This was a project, Global Futures Lab, that I developed a few years ago in trying to imagine and try to involve a broader international community in imagining non-Western futures. And in this case, we linked a traditional craft with, in this case, supposedly present and future devices. So how future can be built by artisans, how future can actually be shared and created with the mixture of something that we consider as part of the past, and we may consider that as part of the future. Then we have, rethinking the present. This is another corner of our methodological, let's say, triangle. And in this case, vernacular algorithms is a project by Tegan Bristow in South Africa, and thinking about the possibility to write code and a coding language and programming language starting from the beading work, traditional for that from that part of Africa, but not only there. So the idea that future and technology can be built on the foundation of heritage and culture, that's an interesting thing. So rethinking the present, that means that how we can almost restart envisioning the future, starting with a new thinking of the present based on new foundations or old foundations. Another example in this case is, for instance, this Forma Fantasma. A few years ago, developed this project about in relation to what if the oil era and modern plastics never happened. And they crafted all this collection of pieces based on a 19th century book on bioplastics. So the idea that we can look back, the idea we can consider something that has already happened in a Western linear perception of time and bring them back to as part of the future is something that is very attractive to us and needed. And then there is co-creating the future. So the idea, again, how we can extend the conversation, how we can include more voices. This is a great example. The Indigenous Protocol of Artificial Intelligence Working Group is a great example going in that specific direction. How we can look at new technology, how you can debate and discuss about how that technology can be related to our traditional practices, can be related to things that are part of our heritage, our past, our traditions, and how we can all together operate in developing a specific technological path, respecting and taking into considerations different trajectories. The MIT Future Heritage Lab is also a very interesting reality in which technology help fostering the conversation about future, but based on heritage and based on past. So linking these two apparent elements that are apparently in the extreme corners of the vision, but that, in our opinion, should be brought closer in a more cyclical perspective. And yes, I could say that's all. I think we almost nailed the time, and there is some time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, I was nudging the slides forward a bit faster than usual, Paolo. Just wanted to make the time.
So we can, I see a few questions, so we can try to, do we have time to answer a few questions?
Oh, muted.
Thank you. Let's slip one of those questions in. Perhaps the second question from Eva. It was, what is sustainable equilibrium? Without non-equilibrium, there's no moving. Therefore, there's no new type of future or future thoughts too.
Yeah, in that case, about the sustainable equilibrium was specifically based on the backtracking concept, and is the idea in that specific case is the idea that and it's not necessarily the ideal one. I think it was something that was part of our conversation because was one of those examples in which the past was considered heavily. So in the backtracking, the sustainable equilibrium means that looking back when there were conditions that seemed sustainable and try to understand in our present how we can regain those conditions looking towards the future. I agree that that sustainable equilibrium is a very aspiring concept and eventually not sustainable in itself. But yes, that where that definition comes from.
Did that answer
Irina,
your
do you
question?
want to answer the other one? That is it necessary to involve more and more everyday people to shape their future too? Or very future-oriented thinking and acting people? Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I think that one was answered pretty well in the end bit about co-creating the future. I think that's definitely the key. I mean, the future, or the history of future making has been a pretty siloed one, and where a minority culture has sort of made those projections on behalf of so much of the world. And so definitely moving forward, any visions of the future co-created, that's the way to go. 100%.
Brilliant. Thanks both.